No one can save you. A tattooed stranger ripped a widow's shirt, but a mountain man arrived and... A young widow is fighting her way through the cold mountain pass when a tattooed stranger steps from the trees. In one violent moment, he tears her shirt and reaches for her baby, claiming the child belongs to him. She screams for help, but the stranger only laughs, whispering the same chilling words again and again. No one can save you. But then the ground shakes with heavy footsteps, and a silent mountain man steps into the clearing. The stranger flees, but not before promising to return. And this time, he won't be alone. Now the widow learns a terrifying secret. Her baby isn't safe, not from the snow, not from the men hunting her, and not from the powerful ranch family that wants the child for themselves. As riders close in, as fires signal across the ridges, one question begins to thunder louder than the hooves chasing them. When the past hunts you through the mountains, and a baby's life hangs in the balance, can even a mountain man save what God has placed in your hands? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The mountain wind whistled through the towering pines, carrying with it the bite of approaching winter. Esther Cadell adjusted her grip on little Micah, who dozed against her shoulder despite the jolting movement of their slow progress. Her free hand gripped the rope of the makeshift hand sled, its runners scraping against loose rocks and patches of early snow. The broken wagon she'd been forced to abandon still weighed heavy on her mind. One more piece of security lost to circumstance. "Just a little further, sweet boy," she whispered to Micah, though her arms ached from carrying him. The narrow pass squeezed between weathered cliff faces, leaving precious little room to maneuver. Shadows lengthened across their path as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the clouds in shades of amber and purple. Esther paused to catch her breath, scanning the steep walls for any sign of shelter. The broken wagon wheel had been the last straw in a journey already fraught with setbacks. Now, with darkness closing in and temperatures dropping, she needed to find somewhere, anywhere, to wait out the night. The crack of a branch snapped her attention forward. A figure emerged from the trees ahead, and Esther's heart seized in her chest. The man's face bore strange markings, crude tattoos that twisted across weather-beaten skin, his eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity, blocking the narrow path completely. "Well now," he drawled, his voice rough as stone on steel, "ain't this convenient?" Esther clutched Micah tighter, taking an instinctive step backward. "Please," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We don't want any trouble." The stranger's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No trouble at all, ma'am. Just need to verify something." He advanced with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, each step deliberate and measured. Esther's back met solid rock. The path offered no escape route, sheer cliff to one side, a steep drop to the other. "Stay back," she warned, though fear made her voice quaver. The man closed the distance in 3 quick strides. Before Esther could cry out, his hand shot forward, grabbing the collar of her shirt. With savage force, he tore the fabric open, exposing her neck and upper chest to the cold mountain air. "Where is it?" he snarled, eyes raking across her skin. "The mark! Where's the birthmark?" Esther screamed, trying to twist away while protecting Micah from being crushed between them. The baby woke with a startled wail, his cries echoing off the canyon walls. The stranger's grip tightened, his fingers digging into her shoulder as he roughly pushed the torn fabric aside. "No one can save you now," he growled, his breath hot against her face. "That child belongs to the Barstow name. Best accept that truth." "Never," Esther kicked out, catching him in the shin. The man barely flinched. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." His free hand reached for Micah, fingers grasping at the baby's blanket. A shadow fell across them both. The stranger went rigid, his hands freezing in place. Slowly, he turned his head to look behind him. Jonah Hale filled the path like a bear risen from winter slumber. His broad shoulders blocked what remained of the dying sunlight, and in his massive hands, he gripped an axe haft with the casual comfort of someone who knew how to use it. His face, partially hidden behind a thick beard, revealed nothing but his eyes, cold and hard as river stones in January. "Take your hands off the lady." Jonah's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder before a storm. The tattooed man's fingers uncurled from Esther's collar, but he didn't step back. "This ain't your concern, mountain man. I'm making it my concern." Jonah shifted his weight, the movement subtle but threatening. "You've got exactly one chance to walk away. I suggest you take it." Esther pressed herself against the rock face, trying to make herself smaller while keeping Micah shielded. The baby's cries had subsided to whimpers, as if even he sensed the tension crackling in the air between the two men. The stranger's hand twitched toward his belt, where a knife handle protruded from its sheath. Jonah's grip tightened on the axe haft, his knuckles whitening. "Last warning," Jonah said, his voice dropping even lower. "Leave her be." For a long moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the tattooed man's shoulders relaxed, though his eyes remained sharp as flint. "This ain't finished," he said, taking a slow step backward. "That child has a destiny that don't include you, woman. The Barstow name will claim what's rightfully theirs." "The only claim that matters is a mother's love," Jonah replied, not moving from his position. "Now go." The stranger retreated another step, then another, his gaze shifting between Esther and Jonah. When he reached the bend in the path, he paused. "We'll meet again." "Best pray we don't," Jonah answered. With a final glare, the tattooed man disappeared around the curve of the canyon wall. The echo of his boots on stone faded slowly into the gathering dusk. Esther's legs gave out, and she slid down the rock face, clutching Micah to her chest. The baby squirmed, letting out a fresh wail of protest at being squeezed too tight. She tried to shush him, but her hands were shaking too badly to do more than pat his back. Jonah remained where he stood for several long moments, watching the path where the stranger had vanished. Finally, he turned to Esther, his expression softening slightly. "You're hurt," he said, nodding toward her torn collar and the red marks on her shoulder. Esther tried to pull the fabric closed with her free hand. "I'll manage," she said, though her voice cracked on the words. "Thank you for intervening." Jonah grunted in acknowledgement. He scanned the canyon walls, then looked back the way Esther had come. "You got a camp nearby?" "No," Esther admitted. "Our wagon, the axle broke this morning. I've been walking since then, trying to find somewhere safe to stop." "Night's coming fast," Jonah observed, "and that fellow might have friends." He seemed to wrestle with some internal debate before continuing. "I've got a cabin, about half a mile up this pass. It ain't much, but it's warm and defensible." Esther hesitated. The stranger's assault had left her wary of any man's offer of help. But the temperature was dropping rapidly, and Micah needed shelter. She studied Jonah's face, finding nothing there but gruff concern. "I don't want to impose," she said carefully. "Ain't an imposition if it's freely offered." Jonah shifted the axe haft to his left hand and extended his right to help her up. "Besides, that little one shouldn't be out in the cold." Esther looked at his offered hand, broad and calloused, but steady. After another moment's consideration, she reached up and took it, allowing him to pull her to her feet. His grip was gentle despite his size, and he released her hand as soon as she was stable. "Thank you," she said again, meaning it even more this time. Jonah simply nodded and moved to grab the rope of her hand sled. "Path gets steeper from here. I'll take this if you can manage the baby." Micah had settled somewhat, his head heavy against Esther's shoulder. She adjusted her hold on him, making sure his blanket was secure against the wind. "We'll manage." "Stay close," Jonah instructed, already starting up the path. "Dark comes quick in these mountains." Esther followed, her mind spinning with questions about the tattooed man's words and the mention of the Barstow name. But for now, survival took precedence over answers. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, following the broad back of the mountain man who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. The wind picked up, carrying the first few flakes of snow. Above them, the stars began to emerge in the deepening blue of the evening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called out to the gathering night. Esther drew closer to Jonah's steady presence, grateful for this unexpected protection in a wilderness that suddenly seemed full of hidden threats. "Take your hands off the lady." Jonah's warning hung in the crisp mountain air. The tattooed stranger's eyes narrowed, calculating. His fingers twitched near Micah's blanket, and then everything exploded into motion. The man lunged, both hands grasping for the baby. Jonah moved like lightning despite his size. The axe haft swept low, catching the stranger behind his knees. As the man stumbled, Jonah's other hand grabbed his collar, using the stranger's own momentum to slam him face first into the dusty trail. The impact drove the breath from the attacker's lungs in a harsh wheeze. "I warned you," Jonah said quietly, keeping pressure on the man's shoulder. The stranger thrashed once, then went still. "You don't understand," he spat, blood from his split lips staining the dirt. "The boy bears the mark. He belongs to the Barstows. He belongs to his mother." Jonah increased the pressure slightly. "Now get!" The man twisted suddenly, rolling free. He scrambled backward on all fours before finding his feet. "This ain't over," he snarled, spitting blood. Then he darted into the trees, branches cracking in his wake. Esther's legs gave out. She sank to her knees, clutching Micah to her chest with trembling arms. The baby wailed, more from the tension in her hold than any harm. Her torn shirt gaped open, and she tried to wrap the fabric around herself while still keeping Micah secure. Jonah shrugged out of his heavy coat. "Here," he said gruffly, holding it out to her without looking directly at her. "Cover yourself." "Thank you," Esther whispered. She adjusted Micah to one arm, long enough to pull the coat around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and pine sap, still warm from his body. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't. Best not to dwell on it." Jonah cut her off, already turning away. "You should get moving. Town's about 15 miles southeast if you keep the sun at your back." "Wait!" Panic edged Esther's voice. "Please, I need to reach the agency station before dark. My wagon broke down, and I've been walking since morning. I don't know these mountains." Jonah's shoulders stiffened. "I don't walk other folks' roads anymore, ma'am. Had my fill of other people's troubles." "But you'll want to gather your things." He nodded toward her scattered supplies. "Lights burning." Esther watched helplessly as he strode away, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. Micah's cries had settled to whimpers, and she bounced him, gently while trying to collect herself. "Hush now, little one," she murmured. "We'll manage. We always do." She pushed herself to her feet, wincing at her scraped knees. The small hand sled had overturned in the scuffle, spilling her meager possessions across the trail. One by one she gathered them, a few clothes, some dried food, a battered pot, and precious flint and steel for fire-making. Her hands shook as she repacked the sled, but she forced them steady. There was no time for weakness. 50 yards down the trail, Jonah stopped. Something about the stranger's tracks bothered him. He crouched, studying the prints in the dirt. They were too precise, too measured. The mark of someone trained to move silent and fast. No common bandit stepped so carefully. His mind returned to the man's tattoos, visible where his shirt had pulled aside during the fight. Among the twisted designs, he'd glimpsed something familiar. The Barstow family crest, worked into the pattern like a secret signature. Jonah had seen that mark before, during his cavalry days. It belonged to one of the most powerful ranching families in the territory. "Damn it all," he muttered. Rising, he looked back up the trail. The woman was still visible, struggling to reload her sled while keeping the baby close. The setting sun painted the canyon walls deep red around her. Jonah rubbed his beard, conscience warring with his hard-earned solitude. That tattoo meant something. The Barstows didn't send trained men after random travelers. Whatever trouble followed that woman and child, it was serious enough to warrant professionals. He'd sworn off other people's battles years ago after that mess on the border. But leaving a mother and baby alone in the mountains with night coming on and a killer on their trail, that wasn't right by any man's measure. Cursing under his breath, Jonah turned back. Esther had just secured the last bundle when his shadow fell across her. She tensed, then relaxed slightly when she recognized him. "Those tracks," Jonah said without preamble. "Man who made them was trained. Military, maybe, or scout service. And he wore the Barstow mark." Esther's face went pale. "You know of the Barstows?" "Know enough to understand they don't send men like that without reason." He studied her face. "Want to tell me what kind of trouble you're in?" She glanced around fearfully. "I can't. Please understand. But I swear on my soul, we've done nothing wrong. We just need to reach somewhere safe." Jonah considered her for a long moment. The baby had fallen quiet, tiny fingers curled into his mother's torn collar. The sun was sinking fast now, temperature dropping with it. "Agency station's too far," he said finally. "Night's coming, and there's snow in that wind. We need to get to higher ground, find shelter till morning." Hope flickered in Esther's eyes. "We?" "There's an old line shack about 2 miles up." Jonah grabbed the sled's rope. "It ain't much, but it's defensible. Walls are solid enough to keep out the cold." "Thank you," Esther breathed. "I know you don't want to be involved. Already I'm involved." He started walking, setting a pace she could manage. "Best get moving. Trail gets rough from here." They climbed steadily as twilight deepened around them. The wind picked up, carrying the first bitter touch of snow. Jonah kept them close to the canyon wall, away from exposed edges. Every few minutes, he would stop to scan their surroundings, listening for anything out of place. Esther followed without complaint, though he could hear her breathing getting heavier. The baby stayed remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Once, when they paused to rest, Jonah caught her rubbing her chest where the stranger had grabbed her. "Far to go?" she asked softly. "Bit further." Jonah squinted at the darkening sky. "Need to pick up the pace. Storm's coming faster than I thought." The first snowflakes began to fall as they rounded a sharp bend in the trail. Ahead, barely visible in the gathering gloom, a crude wooden structure huddled against the mountainside. Jonah held up a hand, signaling Esther to wait while he moved forward to check the cabin. The door creaked as he pushed it open, axe haft ready. But the interior was empty, smelling of dust and old wood. A quick search revealed no signs of recent use. He returned to where Esther waited. "It's clear," he said. "Not much inside, but it'll keep us alive till morning." Esther nodded gratefully, clutching Micah closer as another gust of wind whipped snow around them. Together, they moved toward the shelter, Jonah pulling the sled while keeping one eye on the darkness gathering behind them. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. The boy bears the mark. Whatever that meant, Jonah had a feeling their troubles were far from over. But for now, they had walls between them and the storm, and that would have to be enough. At the cabin's threshold, he paused to make one final check of their back trail. The snow was falling heavier now, obscuring their tracks. Good for hiding their path, but bad for seeing anyone following it. Jonah's hand tightened on the axe haft as he ushered Esther inside. Whatever morning brought, they'd face it behind sturdy walls, with high ground beneath them. For tonight, that would have to do. The wind picked up as they climbed, sending sharp gusts of cold air down from the peaks. Jonah led the way up the slope, his broad shoulders blocking some of the wind from Esther and Micah. Their breath formed cloudy puffs in the darkening air, visible for moments before disappearing into the gathering dusk. Esther stumbled on the uneven ground, trying to balance Micah while managing the rough terrain. The baby had grown heavier in her arms with each passing hour. She paused, adjusting her grip on him for what felt like the 100th time. Jonah glanced back, noting her struggle. Without a word, he stopped and held out his arms. Esther hesitated, only briefly before passing Micah to him. The mountain man cradled the infant with surprising gentleness, tucking him securely against his chest. "Thank you," Esther whispered, flexing her tired arms. She took hold of the hand sled's rope instead, grateful for the change. Though the supplies weighed less than Micah, pulling them up the steep slope still made her muscles burn. They continued climbing in silence. Jonah moved with careful precision, despite carrying the baby, each step placed deliberately on the treacherous ground. The light was failing fast now, shadows stretching long across the mountainside. As they approached the line shack, Jonah slowed his pace. His posture changed, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. Esther watched as his eyes scanned the area around the crude wooden structure, taking in details she might have missed. "Something wrong?" she asked softly. Jonah passed Micah back to her, his expression grim. "Stay here." He moved forward alone, studying the ground near the cabin's entrance. Even in the dim light, Esther could see what had caught his attention. Boot prints marked the dirt around the door, partially obscured by wind-blown pine needles but still visible. Near the cabin's corner, ashes from a fire pit still looked fresh enough to hold warmth. Jonah crouched by the door, examining something on the ground. He carefully lifted a length of rope, fashioned into a crude snare. The knots were skilled work, meant to hold fast once triggered. "They didn't work alone," he said finally, standing. "These tracks are from at least 3 different men. Our tattooed friend wasn't here, though. Prints are wrong for his build." Fear knotted in Esther's stomach. "How long ago?" "Day, maybe 2 at most." Jonah unbarred the door, axe haft ready as he pushed it open. "Stay put while I check inside." The cabin's interior was sparse. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank floor, and few furnishings beyond a rickety table and some wooden crates. Jonah moved through the space methodically, checking corners and shadows. When he finally beckoned Esther inside, his face was troubled. "Someone's been using this place," he said, helping her through the door with Micah. "Can smell tobacco smoke in the walls, fresh enough to be from yesterday." Esther hugged Micah closer as Jonah secured the door, sliding a heavy wooden bar into place across it. The cabin's interior was cold, but at least the walls blocked the wind. What little light remained outside barely penetrated the single grimy window. "We'll need a fire," Jonah said, but we'll keep it small. No sense advertising our location." He moved to the fireplace, checking the chimney for blockages before gathering some of the split wood stacked nearby. "The stranger," Esther said quietly as she settled onto one of the crates. "He was looking for a birthmark. Said I was hiding it." She rubbed absently at her collar where the man had torn her shirt. Why would he think that? Jonah concentrated on building the fire, carefully arranging kindling. Best not to speculate without knowing more. What matters is he'll be back, and he won't come alone next time. The kindling caught, sending a weak orange glow through the cabin. Whatever they want, they mean to take it by force. They shared a meager supper of jerky from Esther's supplies, supplemented with snow melted over the tiny fire. Micah nursed quietly, already half asleep after the long day. The cabin gradually warmed enough to take the edge off the cold, though drafts still whistled through gaps in the walls. "Try to rest," Jonah said, as Esther prepared a makeshift bed for Micah using her shawl. "I'll keep watch." Esther settled the baby, humming softly until his eyes drifted closed. "What if they find us here?" "They won't get through that door easy," Jonah replied, positioning himself by the window. "And we'll hear them coming." His hand rested on the axe haft, a quiet promise of protection. Hours crept by. The fire burned down to embers, leaving the cabin in near darkness. Micah slept peacefully, his tiny breaths steady in the quiet. Esther dozed fitfully, starting awake at every creak of the cabin's timbers. Near midnight, Jonah straightened at his post. In the valley below, barely audible over the wind, came the distant rhythm of hoofbeats, too far to identify, but close enough to set his nerves on edge. He watched the darkness beyond the window, counting the beats until they faded. The night was far from over. Gray light seeped through the cabin's grimy window, heralding the approaching dawn. Jonah moved silently from his watch position, touching Esther's shoulder with a gentle but firm hand. She woke instantly, maternal instinct bringing her to full alertness. "We need to move," he whispered, already gathering their meager supplies. "Before those riders find our trail." Esther nodded, wrapping Micah more securely in her shawl. The baby stirred but didn't cry, somehow sensing the need for quiet. Outside, the mountain air bit sharp and cold, their breath forming dense clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Jonah worked methodically, erasing signs of their presence. He scattered the fire's ashes, brushing away the telltale marks of overnight occupation. With practiced efficiency, he used a pine branch to sweep their footprints from around the cabin, working backward toward a narrow gap between two granite outcroppings. "There's a deer trail through here," he explained softly, helping Esther navigate the tight passage. "Stays high, follows natural features, harder to track." The path wound between weather-worn boulders and stands of hardy pine, barely wide enough for single-file travel. Jonah led the way, occasionally reaching back to steady Esther on particularly treacherous sections. As dawn proper arrived, pale sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the snow-dusted ground. They walked in silence until the sun cleared the eastern peaks. Esther's breathing grew labored on the steeper sections, but she pressed on without complaint. Finally, when they reached a relatively flat stretch, she spoke. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice tight with held-back emotion. "About why they're hunting us." Jonah slowed his pace, glancing back at her. The morning light revealed the worry etched on her face, the dark circles under her eyes speaking of more than just one sleepless night. "I worked at the Barstow Ranch," she continued, adjusting Micah against her shoulder. "Not long, just 3 months in the kitchen. I was already with child when I arrived, my husband barely cold in his grave." She swallowed hard. The old man, Barstow himself, He took strange interest in my condition. Jonah said nothing, but his posture showed he was listening intently as they walked. He would ask odd questions about my family history, about birthmarks and such. I thought nothing of it at first. Old men often ramble. But then I began overhearing things. Whispers among the ranch hands about his will, about some special marking that could determine inheritance. They paused at a switchback, and Jonah offered her his water skin. Esther took a grateful sip before continuing. The midwife, she came to me one night after examining me, said she had seen something, a mark on the baby through her special ways. Told me the child had been claimed already, that I needed to run. Esther's voice cracked. I left that very night, never looked back until yesterday. Jonah absorbed this information in silence, his weathered face troubled. They continued along the trail, the morning sun now strong enough to begin melting the frost on the pine needles. Drops of water fell around them like rain. The birthmark they mentioned, he finally said. Does Micah have one? Esther shook her head. Nothing I've ever seen, but that man yesterday, he seemed so certain. By mid-morning, they reached a frozen creek cutting through a small ravine. Jonah called a halt, recognizing Esther's increasing fatigue. While she settled on a fallen log to nurse Micah, he gathered dry twigs and built a small fire, just enough to warm their stiff fingers. The sling you're using won't do for long travel, he observed, eyeing the makeshift carrier she had fashioned from her shawl. Without further comment, he began working with some spare leather straps from his pack, cutting and knotting with practiced movements. Esther watched as he crafted a proper carrying sling, the kind used by native women she had seen. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy, testing each knot for security. You seem familiar with making these, she ventured. A shadow passed across Jonah's face. Learned from the Apache. Before everything changed. He didn't elaborate, focusing instead on finishing the sling. The new carrier distributed Micah's weight more evenly across Esther's back, leaving her hands free for balance. She tested it carefully, relief evident in her expression as she found it much more comfortable than her previous arrangement. They continued their journey after the brief rest, following the ridgeline through increasingly rocky terrain. Ice patches made the going treacherous, forcing them to pick their way carefully across exposed sections. Esther's exhaustion showed in her slower pace and occasional stumbles, though she pushed forward without complaint. The sun tracked across the sky as they walked, shadows lengthening as afternoon waned toward evening. Jonah maintained a steady pace, but kept close watch on his companions, noting Esther's growing weariness. Finally, as the light began to fade, he pointed to a break in the trees ahead. My cabin's just beyond that clearing, he said. Real cabin, not a line shack. Built it myself. Esther's relief was palpable. They emerged from the trees into a natural meadow, now covered in untouched snow. A solid log cabin stood at the far end, its sturdy construction evident even at a distance. Jonah surveyed the area carefully, checking for any signs of disturbance. No tracks, he confirmed, satisfaction in his voice. Place hasn't been touched since I left it. The cabin was larger than the line shack, built to withstand the mountain winters. A stone chimney rose from the peaked roof, and split firewood was stacked neatly along one wall. Jonah moved ahead to check the perimeter, while Esther waited with Micah at the edge of the clearing. After a thorough inspection, Jonah returned and led them to the cabin's door. He pulled a key from around his neck, unlocking the heavy padlock. The door swung open with a creak of well-oiled hinges, revealing a space that, while simple, spoke of careful craftsmanship and attention to detail. Inside, he said softly, standing aside to let Esther enter. "You'll be safe here." Esther paused in the doorway, looking up at him with tired eyes that held equal measures of gratitude and lingering fear. "Will we?" Jonah's answer was to follow her in and firmly bar the door behind them, his action speaking louder than any words of reassurance could. The cabin's interior held the familiar scent of pine smoke and dried herbs. Jonah moved with practiced efficiency, striking flint to tinder in the stone fireplace. Warm light gradually filled the single room, revealing sturdy log walls and simple furnishings, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. "It ain't much," Jonah said quietly, "but it's dry and defendable." Esther stood in the center of the room, gently swaying with Micah. The baby's eyes were heavy with sleep, tiny fingers curled against his mother's shoulder. Jonah gathered several thick wool blankets from a trunk, arranging them into a soft nest near the growing fire. "Here," he gestured to the makeshift bed. "Get the little one settled first." Esther carefully lowered Micah into the blankets, tucking them snugly around his small form. The baby sighed, contentedly, warm and safe for the first time in days. She brushed a tender kiss across his forehead before straightening. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning far more than just the blankets. Jonah nodded once, then moved to secure the cabin. "Need to show you some things," he said. "Ways to stay safe if—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. He demonstrated how to brace the heavy wooden door with a beam that fit perfectly into iron brackets on either side. "Strongest part of the cabin," he explained. "Even 3 men couldn't break through without making enough noise to wake the dead." Esther watched attentively as he showed her other defensive measures, how to adjust the fireplace damper to minimize visible smoke, which floorboards creaked and which were silent, where he kept spare weapons hidden but accessible. "Most important thing is keeping quiet if there's danger," he continued, voice low and steady. "A crying baby can draw trouble for miles in these mountains." He knelt beside the blanket nest where Micah lay, showing Esther how to make a small tent with a wool blanket. "Indians taught me this trick. Creates a private space, helps calm little ones quick. The darkness and close warmth reminds them of being held." As if to demonstrate, Micah began to fuss, tiny face scrunching up before the first cry could escape. Without hesitation, Jonah scooped him up with surprisingly gentle hands, cradling the infant against his broad chest. He draped the blanket over both their heads, creating a dark, quiet space. Esther watched in amazement as Jonah slowly rocked, humming so softly it was barely audible. Within moments, Micah's whimpers ceased. When Jonah lowered the blanket, the baby was peaceful again, one tiny hand clutching the mountain man's rough shirt. "Where did you learn to do that?" Esther asked softly. A shadow passed across Jonah's weathered face. "Long time ago. Different life." He carefully returned Micah to his nest of blankets. Moving to the fireplace, Jonah lifted a cast-iron pot that had been simmering at the edge of the flames. Rich, savory steam rose as he ladled venison broth into 2 tin cups. He handed one to Esther, who accepted it gratefully. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping the hot broth. Esther noticed a large tear in the shoulder of Jonah's shirt, likely from their hurried travel through the dense underbrush. Without a word, she retrieved her small sewing kit from her remaining supplies. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his shirt. Jonah looked surprised, but nodded. Esther worked quickly with practiced movements, her neat stitches closing the ragged tear. Her fingers brushed his shoulder as she tied off the thread, feeling the tension in his muscles even through the fabric. "Much obliged," he said quietly when she finished. "Been a while since anyone's mended for me." The fire popped and crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, The wind whispered through pine boughs, a lonely sound that emphasized their isolation. Esther found herself studying Jonah's profile as he stared into the flames, noting the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both sun exposure and sorrow. "You've been alone up here a long time," she observed gently. Not quite a question. Jonah continued watching the fire. "By choice," he replied after a long moment. "Lost more than I care to remember. Seemed easier to keep to myself after that." Something in his voice, a carefully contained pain, made Esther's heart ache. She wanted to ask more, but sensed his wounds were still too raw for questions. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for not keeping to yourself yesterday." His eyes met hers briefly, acknowledging what remained unspoken. Then he stood, checking the door's barrier one final time before settling into one of the chairs positioned to watch both the entrance and the single window. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll keep watch." Esther wanted to protest that he needed sleep too, but exhaustion was already pulling at her limbs. She curled up beside Micah in the nest of blankets, her son's peaceful breathing more comforting than any lullaby. The night passed without disturbance, marked only by the gradually dying fire and Jonah's occasional movement as he tended the flames. When pale dawn light began filtering through the window, Esther woke to find him still at his post, alert despite the long vigil. "Going to check the perimeter," he said quietly, noting she was awake. "Stay inside until I return." Esther nodded, watching through the window as Jonah moved into the crisp morning air. He circled the cabin methodically, studying the ground with the focus of a seasoned tracker. The sun was just clearing the eastern peaks when he completed his inspection, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "No tracks," he reported upon returning. "Not even game trails nearby. We're alone up here for now." Yet, despite the reassuring news, Esther noticed Jonah's attention repeatedly drawn to the window. He moved restlessly around the cabin, checking supplies and adjusting the placement of tools with transparent purpose. Something was needling at his instincts. The morning light strengthened, illuminating the meadow beyond the cabin in sharp detail. Jonah stood at the window, one hand unconsciously gripping the smooth, worn handle of his axe. His entire body tensed as movement caught his eye at the tree line. A figure emerged from the shadows of the forest, walking with unhurried steps toward the cabin. The stranger's gait was measured and calm, not the furtive movement of someone meaning harm, but not entirely unthreatening either. Jonah's fingers tightened on the axe handle as the figure drew closer, stepping fully into the morning light. His face remained impassive, but his body was coiled with potential energy, ready to defend his unexpected charges if necessary. The tension in Jonah's shoulders eased as the figure emerged into full view. Slight smile crossed his weathered face as he recognized the measured stride and familiar silhouette of Henry Talaska. The Cherokee tracker's dark hair was peppered with more gray than Jonah remembered from their last meeting over a year ago, but his movements still held the same quiet grace. "Henry," Jonah called out softly, setting his axe aside. He opened the cabin door, gesturing for Esther to stay back. "Been a long time, friend." Henry approached with open palms raised in the traditional greeting. "Too long, brother," he replied, his voice warm and deep. His keen eyes took in the cabin's defensive positioning and Jonah's protective stance. "Though I see you've had your reasons for keeping to yourself." Jonah stepped aside, allowing Henry to enter. The tracker removed his hat respectfully as he caught sight of Esther and Micah. "Ma'am," he said with a slight bow, "I hope my arrival didn't cause you undue worry." Esther clutched Micah closer, but something in Henry's gentle manner helped her relax. "You're a friend of Jonah's?" "Known this stubborn man for many seasons," Henry confirmed. He reached into his leather bag and withdrew a small deerskin pouch. "I brought something for your little one. Herbs my people use to ease winter coughs and help babies sleep peaceful." He offered the pouch to Esther with both hands, a gesture of respect. "That's very kind," Esther said softly, accepting the gift. The pouch gave off a subtle, pleasant scent of dried mint and other plants she didn't recognize. "Sit," Jonah said, pulling out one of the rough-hewn chairs near the fire. "What brings you up this high, Henry? Last I heard you were working treaties down near the rail lands." Henry's expression grew serious as he settled into the chair. "That's partly why I came looking for you, brother. Been hearing troubling talk down at the rail spur." He glanced at Esther. "Talk about the Barstow Ranch and some unusual hiring they've been doing." Esther's face paled. She sank onto the edge of the blanket nest, holding Micah close. "What kind of hiring?" Jonah asked, though his grim expression suggested he already knew. "Retrieval men," Henry said, speaking the words carefully. "The kind that wear their violence like proud marks on their skin. The Barstow sons have been gathering them, offering good money to bring back any infant rumored to share Barstow blood before their father's will is read." The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. Micah stirred and whimpered, picking up on his mother's distress. Esther rocked him gently, her hands trembling. Jonah stood abruptly. "Need more wood," he muttered, grabbing his axe. The door closed firmly behind him. Henry watched him go with understanding in his dark eyes. "He still carries old wounds," he explained to Esther. "Your situation likely reminds him of another child he once tried to protect." "What happened?" Esther asked softly. "That's his story to tell," Henry replied. "But know that his heart is good, even if his manner is rough." Outside, the steady thunk of Jonah's axe punctuated their conversation. Each strike seemed to carry the weight of memory and regret. When he finally returned, his arms full of split wood, some of the tension had left his face. He stacked the logs carefully near the fireplace, then stood with his back to the room for a long moment. When he turned, his expression was resolved but vulnerable. "Reckon you ought to know," he said quietly, addressing Esther but not quite meeting her eyes. "Why I left the cavalry. Why I understand something about trying to protect the innocent." He sat heavily in the remaining chair, running a calloused hand through his hair. "Was stationed near the Apache territories, serving as a scout. Found a young boy one day, maybe 6 or 7 years old, half dead from thirst. His family had been killed in a raid, not by Indians, mind you, but by cattle thieves using Apache arrows to cover their tracks." Jonah's voice grew rough with memory. "I was supposed to be tracking a war party. Instead, I spent 3 days getting that boy to safety, making sure he reached his remaining kin. By the time I got back, the commanding officer had already written his report. Called me a deserter, claimed I'd abandoned my post in the face of enemy action." He laughed bitterly. "Didn't matter that I'd saved an innocent life. Didn't matter that I could prove the raid wasn't Apache work. My commission was gone, my reputation ruined. Mary, my fiancée, she believed the official story, couldn't bear to be associated with a disgraced soldier." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Esther's eyes shone with compassion as she watched Jonah struggle with the painful memories. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "That boy lived because of you." Jonah met her gaze finally, something easing in his expression at her simple acceptance. "Been a long time since I let myself care about doing right," he admitted. "Seemed safer to just stay away from other folks' troubles." "Yet here you are," Henry observed with gentle humor. "Right in the middle of trouble again." The tension broke slightly. Jonah's mouth quirked in a reluctant smile. "Reckon so." As evening approached, Henry produced some dried buffalo meat and corn cakes from his pack to supplement their meal. The three adults sat close to the fire, sharing food and quiet conversation, while Micah dozed contentedly in his blanket nest. There was a comfortable feeling in the cabin. Not quite peace, with the threat still looming outside, but a sense of fellowship that none of them had experienced in too long. Henry told stories of his people that made Esther laugh despite her worries. Jonah's responses, though still brief, carried less weight of isolation. When the meal was finished, Henry stood and went to the window. Soft white flakes were beginning to drift past the glass. "Snow's coming," he announced. "Heavy by the feel of the air. We could be here a while." He turned to face Jonah and Esther. "If you're willing, I'd like to stay a few days. Extra eyes and ears might come in handy." Jonah nodded, relief visible in his features, though he tried to hide it. "Much obliged, Henry. We can use the help." Outside, the snow continued falling, transforming the dark landscape into something softer, quieter. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly as Micah's peaceful breathing mingled with the soft murmur of adult voices. For this moment at least, they were safe. 3 unlikely allies and 1 small baby, brought together by circumstance but bound now by something stronger. Morning brought a transformed landscape. The meadow lay hushed beneath a thick white blanket, the snow still falling in lazy spirals. Inside the cabin, Jonah stirred the fire's embers while Henry studied the pristine expanse through a frosted window. "Trail's gone," Henry observed quietly. "No moving through this until it settles." Jonah nodded grimly. "Then we make the most of being stuck." He turned to where Esther sat, nursing Micah near the warmth of the hearth. "First priority is securing what we've got." They worked methodically through the morning hours. Jonah and Henry hauled load after load of split wood, stacking it carefully against the cabin's outer walls. The wood would serve double duty, insulation against the bitter cold, and a makeshift barrier if trouble came. Inside, Esther wrapped Micah snugly and laid him in a corner padded with blankets. She helped the men reinforce the window shutters, holding boards steady while they hammered. Her hands were red with cold, but she worked without complaint. "Need to set some snares," Henry said as the sun climbed higher. "Snow this deep, rabbits will be moving close to shelter seeking food." He pulled lengths of wire from his pack and showed Esther the proper way to handle them. "These aren't just for game. Placed right, they'll warn us if anyone approaches through the trees." Jonah disappeared into the back room and returned with something wrapped in oiled cloth. He hesitated before unwrapping it, revealing a small pistol. The metal gleamed dully in the firelight. "It ain't much," he said, offering it to Esther. "But you should have something to protect yourself and the boy." Esther accepted the weapon carefully. "I've never—" "I'll show you," Jonah said. His voice was gentle but firm. "It's simple enough. Just got to remember 3 things. Keep your finger off the trigger until you mean to shoot, always know where it's pointed, and never hesitate if someone means you harm." They spent an hour practicing with the unloaded pistol, how to hold it steady, how to aim along the barrel, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Esther's hands shook at first, but grew more confident with each repetition. "Good," Jonah said finally. "You're a natural." He reloaded the pistol and showed her how to keep it close, but secure. While Micah napped in his corner, Jonah and Henry spoke in low voices by the window. Esther busied herself preparing a stew from dried meat and the last of their vegetables, but she caught fragments of their conversation. "Ridgway's closest," Henry was saying. "Sheriff Cutter's a good man, fair-minded." "Too obvious," Jonah countered. "They'll watch the roads. Reservation agency might be safer. More people, harder to make someone disappear. 3 days hard ride in good weather. This snow." Henry gestured at the white world outside. Could take twice that long. More chances for ambush. The snow tapered off by afternoon, leaving the world sparkling and new. Jonah surprised them all by scooping up Micah and heading for the door. "Baby needs fresh air," he said gruffly when Esther started to protest. "Won't take him far." Through the window, Esther watched as Jonah walked slowly through the knee-deep snow, holding Micah securely against his chest. He stopped in a patch of weak sunlight and carefully turned the baby's face upward. "Look there," she heard him say softly. "See them clouds moving? That's how you know when weather's changing. Important thing to learn out here." Micah cooed and reached toward the sky with mittened hands. A smile ghosted across Jonah's weathered face, the first real smile Esther had seen from him. Henry appeared at her shoulder. "He's good with the little one," he observed, though he'd never admit it. "He's full of surprises," Esther agreed quietly. The short winter day was already fading when they gathered for supper. The stew had turned out well, filling the cabin with savory steam. Henry broke corn cakes into his bowl and shared what he'd learned about the Barstow situation. "Old Harlan's failing fast," he said. "Doctor at the rail station says he won't last the month. His sons have been circling like vultures, each one claiming they're the rightful heir." "The birthmark story," Esther said. "Where did it come from?" Henry stirred his stew thoughtfully. "There's talk that Harlan wrote something strange in his will, that any child bearing the family mark could inherit, even if not born to his sons. Some say he was addled with fever when he wrote it. Others think he meant to spite his boys for their greed." "They'll kill for it," Esther whispered, her face pale. "They'll kill Micah just to be sure." "Not while we draw breath," Jonah said firmly. His hand found hers across the table and squeezed gently. After supper, Esther discovered another of Jonah's hidden talents. While she'd been cooking, he'd disappeared into the lean-to and emerged with a rough-hewn cradle fashioned from spare boards and branches. "It ain't pretty," he apologized, setting it near the fire. "But it's sturdy enough." Esther ran her fingers over the smooth, sanded edges. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." She tucked Micah into the cradle with his blankets, humming quietly until his eyes drifted closed. The baby seemed to sense the security of his new bed, falling into a deeper sleep than usual. Night settled heavily over the snow-covered landscape. Jonah and Henry sat by the fire, speaking in low voices while cleaning their weapons. Esther tried not to listen to their plans for defending the cabin, focusing instead on mending a tear in one of Micah's blankets. The quiet was shattered by a sharp crack that echoed through the valley, distinct enough to make them all freeze. "Gunshot?" Esther whispered, her hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at her waist. "Too far to tell for certain," Henry said, moving to the window. "Could be ice breaking in the creek, could be someone hunting after dark. Or someone sending a signal," Jonah added grimly. He checked his rifle's action, then took up position at the other window. "Best we all stay alert tonight." The sound wasn't repeated, but the peaceful atmosphere of earlier was gone. In its place settled a tense watchfulness as they waited to see what the darkness might bring. Dawn crept over the snowbound valley, painting the white landscape in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Jonah shouldered his rifle while Henry checked his pistol and knife. "Stay inside," Jonah instructed Esther firmly. "Bar the door behind us. Don't open it unless you hear our signal. 3 quick taps, then 2 slow." Esther nodded, cradling Micah against her shoulder. "How long will you be gone?" "Not past midday," Henry answered. "We'll circle the valley, read what signs we can find." He adjusted his wool scarf against the cold. "Keep the fire low. Less smoke means less chance of being spotted." After the men left, Esther secured the door and added a small log to the banked coals. Micah fussed slightly, and she warmed his morning milk near the hearth, humming softly to keep them both calm. Outside, Jonah and Henry moved like shadows through the trees. Fresh snow made tracking easier, but also meant their own prints would be visible to others. They stuck to areas where pine boughs had created small, snow-free patches, working their way down the slope. Henry stopped suddenly, crouching to examine something in the snow. "Here," he whispered, pointing to a broken pine twig. "Someone passed through yesterday evening." Jonah studied the break. The wood was still green, the sap barely frozen. "Heading north?" "Yes." Henry brushed snow from another branch. "At least 2 riders, maybe 3. He pointed to a partially buried hoof print. "Heavy horses, not mountain ponies." They continued their careful descent. Near a sheltered hollow, Jonah spotted a scatter of cigarette ash against the white ground. He touched it with one finger, cold, but not yet dissolved by snow. "Recent," he murmured, "within the last day." Henry nodded grimly. "They're searching the whole valley, methodical-like." "The tattooed man knows his business," Jonah agreed. "He'll have them checking every cabin, every cave." They completed their circuit before the sun reached its peak, finding more signs of the searching riders, a campsite hastily covered, marks of horses tied to trees, even a discarded tin can that still smelled faintly of beans. Back at the cabin, Esther opened the door at their signal, relief evident on her face. While she warmed coffee over the fire, the men shared what they'd found. "They're too close," Jonah concluded. "We need to be ready to move fast if they find us." He stood, already planning. "I've got 3 horses in the lean-to. We should get them prepared." The afternoon turned bitter cold as clouds rolled in, promising more snow. Despite the chill, Jonah led Esther outside, Micah securely bundled against her back in a sling Henry had fashioned. "Time you learned to shoot proper," Jonah said, handing her the pistol. He'd set up several chunks of firewood as targets along a nearby snowbank. Esther's first shots went wide, the recoil stronger than she expected. But Jonah was patient, adjusting her grip, showing her how to breathe and squeeze the trigger smoothly. "Don't rush," he instructed. "Better to take time and hit true than shoot fast and miss." Gradually, her aim improved. The weight of the pistol became more familiar in her hand, and she managed to hit the closest target 3 times in succession. "Good," Jonah said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "You're learning quick." While they practiced, Henry took over Micah's care, showing a gentleness that belied his weathered appearance. The baby seemed content in the Cherokee man's arms, fascinating by the eagle feather Henry used to entertain him. Between shooting lessons, Henry taught Esther the basics of tracking. He showed her how prints changed as snow melted and refroze, how to tell if tracks were fresh or old, and what signs indicated a person trying to hide their trail. "Snow holds memory," he explained, pointing to a rabbit's passing. "But you must learn to read it quick, before the story fades." As evening approached, they returned inside. Esther prepared a thick stew from their dwindling supplies, while Jonah and Henry discussed watch rotations for the night. The warm meal brought color back to their cold-nipped faces. As they ate, Esther noticed Jonah seemed lost in thought, troubled by something beyond their immediate danger. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Been thinking about why I chose this life." He stared into his bowl. "Told myself it was about finding peace, but maybe..." He paused, struggling with the words. "Maybe I was just hiding, running from what happened before." Esther reached across the table, touching his arm gently. "Sometimes what we think is running away is really running toward something we can't see yet." She smiled softly. I believe God brings people together for reasons that aren't clear at first." Jonah's expression softened momentarily, but then he drew back, both physically and emotionally. He stood abruptly, carrying his bowl to the wash basin. The moment of vulnerability had passed, sealed behind his usual stoic mask. As the fire burned low, Henry pulled on his heavy coat. "I'll take first watch," he said, checking his weapons. 4 hours, then wake you, Jonah?" Jonah nodded. "I'll spell you at midnight." The hours crept by. Esther tried to sleep but found herself listening to every creak and whisper of wind. Micah slumbered peacefully in his rough-hewn cradle, one tiny hand curled against his cheek. Just before midnight, Jonah stepped outside to relieve Henry. The cold air bit at his face as he looked out over the moonlit valley. Something caught his attention, a scent carried on the wind. Smoke, but not from their carefully banked fire. This came from somewhere below, on the western ridge. Jonah touched Henry's shoulder, pointing silently. A faint orange glow flickered against the clouds. "Signal fire," Jonah whispered, his breath frosting in the night air. "They're calling to each other." Henry nodded grimly. Both men stood watching the distant flame, knowing their sanctuary might not stay secret much longer. A chill wind whistled through the cabin's cracks, carrying the acrid scent of distant smoke. Jonah moved silently through the darkness, touching Henry's shoulder first, then gently shaking Esther awake. Her eyes opened instantly, alert despite the early hour. "Time to go," Jonah whispered. "That smoke's still coming up from below." Esther nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter as she rose. She lifted Micah from his cradle with practiced care, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead before securing him in the sling Henry had made. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Jonah worked quickly, gathering only what they couldn't survive without. He rolled thick wool blankets into tight bundles, packed dried meat and hard biscuits, and counted out ammunition for both rifle and pistol. His movements were precise, wasting no motion. Henry checked their water skins, filling them from the barrel of melted snow. "Dawn's about an hour off," he murmured. "We'll have better light for the ridge trail then." Esther moved carefully through the cabin, touching familiar objects one last time. The rough-hewn table where they'd shared meals, the cradle Jonah had carved, the hearthstones that had warmed them. Strange how a place could become home in just a few days. Outside, frost painted every surface in delicate white patterns. Their boots crunched on frozen snow as they made their way to the lean-to. The horses shifted nervously, steam rising from their nostrils in the pre-dawn air. Even the animals sensed the tension, tossing their heads and stamping as Jonah and Henry fitted them with saddles and bridles. "Easy now," Jonah soothed, running a weathered hand down his mount's neck. The big bay settled somewhat under his touch, but its ears remained pricked forward, alert for danger. Henry helped Esther mount, making sure she was secure with Micah. The Cherokee tracker had fashioned clever straps that helped her hold the baby while keeping both hands free for the reins when needed. Jonah led them out, choosing his path carefully along the ridge. The sun rose slowly, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Under different circumstances, the view might have been breathtaking. But today, every open space felt like exposure. Every shadow might hide a threat. They rode in tense silence, following a narrow trail that wound between stands of pine and bare-branched aspen. Progress was frustratingly slow. The snow lay deep in shaded areas, forcing them to pick their way carefully. Esther held Micah close, trying to shield him from the worst of the cold. The baby remained remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Henry rode sweep, watching their back trail for any sign of pursuit. His dark eyes missed nothing, constantly scanning the terrain around them. Occasionally he would raise his hand, and they would pause while he listened intently to the mountain sounds. Near midday, they reached a sheltered hollow thick with pine trees. Jonah raised his hand, signaling a stop. "We'll rest the horses," he said quietly. "No fire, though. Smoke carries too far in this air." They dismounted stiffly, muscles aching from hours in the saddle. Esther found a fallen log to sit on, while she nursed Micah. Henry shared out strips of dried venison and hard biscuits. The food was cold, but filling. Jonah didn't eat. Instead, he moved a short distance away, studying the trail ahead. Something in his posture made Henry frown. "Trouble?" the Cherokee asked softly. "Maybe." Jonah gestured ahead. "I'm going to scout a bit. Keep watch here." Before Esther could protest, he had melted into the trees, moving as silently as a shadow. The minutes crept by with agonizing slowness. Micah finished nursing and dozed against his mother's chest. Henry kept his hand near his pistol, eyes constantly moving. When Jonah returned, his expression was grim. "3 riders crossed our trail less than half a mile ahead," he reported. "Fresh tracks, probably from this morning. They're moving fast but not rushing, like they know they're closing in." Esther felt her heart speed up. "What do we do?" Henry stood, brushing snow from his leggings. "I know another way," he said. "Through a ravine east of here. Slower going but more cover. Rock walls will hide us better than trees." Jonah considered this, then nodded. "Show me." They remounted, following Henry as he led them on a sharp turn to the east. The ravine proved to be a narrow cut between towering rock faces, barely wide enough for the horses to pass single file. The walls provided good cover, but the footing was treacherous, loose scree mixed with patches of ice and snow. They were forced to dismount and lead the horses through the worst stretches. Esther struggled to keep her balance on the uncertain ground while holding Micah secure. Without a word, Jonah appeared beside her, one strong hand under her elbow, steadying her over the roughest parts. The afternoon wore on, shadows lengthening as the sun slipped behind the western peaks. The temperature dropped sharply. Henry finally called a halt beneath a rocky overhang that provided some shelter from the wind. "Can't risk going further in the dark," he said quietly. "Ground's too dangerous." Jonah nodded agreement. "Cold camp," he ordered. "No fire, no hot food. We'll eat what we can and try to rest." They arranged the space as best they could, laying blankets over pine boughs to keep them off the frozen ground. The horses were tied close, their bulk providing some windbreak. Henry pulled out more dried meat and their remaining biscuits, sharing them out in the growing darkness. Just as they finished eating, Micah began to fuss. The sound, though soft, seemed incredibly loud in the stillness. Esther quickly offered him her breast, but the baby turned his head away, his whimpers growing louder. "Shh, little one," Esther whispered desperately, rocking him gently. "Please, sweetheart. Please be quiet." Jonah's eyes never stopped scanning the darkness beyond their shelter. Every instinct told him that sound carried far in the crystal-clear mountain air. A baby's cry could travel for miles, leading their pursuers right to them. Esther tried everything she could think of, patting Micah's back, walking with him, humming softly in his ear. The baby continued to fuss, working himself toward a full cry. Henry moved closer, reaching into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out a small object, the eagle feather he had used to entertain Micah at the cabin. With gentle fingers, he brushed it across the baby's cheek. Micah's cries hitched, then softened as he focused on the feather's movement. Henry continued the calming gesture, adding a low whisper in Cherokee. a prayer or blessing, though Esther couldn't understand the words. Gradually, the baby's eyes grew heavy, and his fussing subsided into sleep. Esther sagged with relief, cradling her son close. "Thank you," she breathed. Henry tucked the feather away with a small smile. "All creatures respond to gentleness," he said softly, "even the smallest ones." Jonah remained at the edge of their shelter, rifle across his knees as he kept watch. The night pressed in around them, full of small sounds, the whisper of wind, the creak of branches, the occasional distant call of an owl. Any one of those sounds might be natural, or might signal approaching danger. The moon rose, casting sharp shadows across the snow. They huddled together for warmth, speaking only in whispers when necessary. Sleep came in fitful doses, each of them waking at the slightest noise. Through it all, Micah mercifully remained quiet, as if understanding their need for silence. Jonah watched the darkness, his mind racing through possibilities. The tracks they'd seen were too precise, too professional. These weren't ordinary ranch hands searching for them. The tattooed man had brought in skilled hunters, men who knew how to track, prey through winter mountains. Their only advantage was Henry's knowledge of these peaks and valleys. That, and the fact that their pursuers might not expect them to risk traveling with a baby in such conditions. A soft sound made him turn. Esther had shifted in her sleep, one hand protectively curved around Micah. The sight stirred something in Jonah's chest, an unfamiliar ache that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked away quickly, focusing again on the night beyond their shelter. They were his responsibility now, whether he'd wanted that or not. He would see them safely through this, or die trying. The night crept forward with agonizing slowness. Every shadow held potential threat. Every sound might mean discovery. They could only wait for dawn and pray their hunters had not drawn closer in the darkness. Dawn crept across the eastern sky in pale fingers of light. Frost coated every surface, making the world glitter like diamonds. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Today, it was just one more challenge to overcome. Jonah helped Esther mount her horse, while Henry secured their minimal gear. They'd eaten a cold breakfast of dried beef and hard biscuits, washing it down with snow melted in their mouths. No one complained about the meager fare or the biting cold. They all understood the need for silence and speed. The ravine proved treacherous in the early morning light. Ice glazed the rocks, and loose stones shifted unpredictably under the horses' hooves. They were forced to dismount and lead the animals through the worst stretches, picking their way carefully between jagged boulders and patches of frozen ground. "Easy now," Jonah murmured, steadying Esther's elbow as she navigated a particularly steep section. She nodded gratefully, keeping Micah tight against her chest in his sling. The morning wore on, each step requiring careful consideration. Henry took point, testing the ground before the others followed. His experience in the mountains showed in every deliberate movement, every careful choice of path. Just before mid-morning, a sound made them all freeze. Micah had started coughing, sharp, quick bursts that echoed off the ravine walls. Esther immediately pressed him closer, adjusting his blankets with trembling fingers. "Shh, sweet boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hush now, my love." She tucked another fold of wool around his face, trying to warm the air he breathed. Jonah watched with growing concern. The boy's cough worried him more than he wanted to admit. A sick infant in these conditions could quickly become desperate trouble. They needed to find better shelter soon, somewhere they could warm the child properly. "We need to keep moving," Henry said softly. "Sound carries far in these walls." They pressed on, making what speed they could over the difficult terrain. Around midday, they paused briefly to rest the horses and share out more of their dwindling supplies. While Esther nursed Micah, Henry studied the cliffs above them. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a narrow trail switching back up the ravine wall. "Elk use that path. Leads to a small plateau above. Might give us a better view of what we're dealing with." Jonah considered the steep trail. "How long to reach the top?" "Hour, maybe more. Ground's not good, but it's manageable." They discussed it briefly, agreeing the advantage of height outweighed the time lost. The climb proved as challenging as Henry had suggested. The trail was little more than a game path, forcing them to lead the horses single file. In places, the drop to their right was sheer enough to make Esther's head swim. She kept her eyes firmly on Jonah's broad back ahead of her, focusing on each step. Finally, they reached the plateau, a relatively flat expanse perhaps 50 yards across. Scrub pine provided some cover, and the elevation offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory. While Henry tended to the horses, Jonah moved to the edge, studying the valley below through Henry's borrowed spyglass. Long minutes passed as he scanned methodically. Esther watched his face, trying to read his expression. Finally, he lowered the glass. "3 riders," he said quietly. "Following the main trail below, moving slow, checking sign." He paused. "The tattooed man's leading them." Esther felt her heart speed up. "How far?" "Couple miles back, maybe less. They're being careful, but they're gaining." Henry joined them at the edge. "We should rest while we can. Plan our next move." They settled in the shelter of the pines. Esther gave Micah another feeding while the men conferred in low voices. She tried not to listen, but fragments reached her. Talk of false trails, splitting up, drawing their pursuers away. Her arms tightened around her son. Finally, Jonah approached her. "Henry and I need to lay some false sign," he said. "Try to buy us time. You'll stay here, keep hidden until we return." "No." The word came out before she could stop it. When Jonah frowned, she continued quickly. "I mean, I don't want you risking yourself alone. Either of you. We should stay together." "Esther, please." She met his eyes steadily. "I've seen how these men operate. They won't show mercy if they catch you." Something flickered in Jonah's expression. Surprise, perhaps, at her concern for his safety. Before he could respond, Henry joined them. "Sun's dropping," he observed. "We need to move soon if we're going to make the line shack by dark." Jonah nodded slowly. 2 hours' ride, if we push it." "The old trapping cabin?" Esther asked. At Jonah's nod, she gathered Micah closer. "Will it be safe?" "Safer than being in the open after dark," Henry replied. "These temperatures, we need shelter." They began their careful descent from the plateau. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the snow as they picked their way down, leading the horses on the narrowest sections. Micah dozed in his sling, worn out from the long day's travel. The sun was touching the western peaks by the time they reached more level ground. They mounted up for the final push to the line shack, moving as quickly as they dared in the failing light. Jonah set a steady pace, choosing their path with care to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Dusk was settling over the valley when they finally approached the cabin. They dismounted in a small grove of pines, preparing to approach on foot. That's when they saw it, the warm glow of lamplight seeping through the cabin's single window. Jonah's hand went to his rifle. Henry melted into the shadows, moving to circle around back. Esther stood frozen. Micah clutched to her chest as they all stared at that telling light. Someone had reached their intended refuge first. The horses shifted restlessly, sensing their handler's tension. Wind sighed through the pines, carrying the bitter promise of more snow. They couldn't stay in the open. but the occupied cabin meant their options were rapidly dwindling. Jonah moved closer to Esther, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay here with the horses. Keep Micah quiet." His eyes never left the cabin's dim window. "Henry and I will check it out." Esther wanted to protest, to beg him not to go, but she knew they had no choice. They needed to know who waited in that cabin. She nodded once, drawing deeper into the shadows of the pines. The two men moved forward with practiced stealth, becoming little more than shadows themselves in the growing darkness. Esther held her breath, straining to hear any sound of confrontation. Micah stirred against her chest, but didn't wake. The lamplight continued to glow steadily from the cabin window, a deceptively welcoming sight in the gathering night. Who waited inside? Friend or foe? Their salvation or their doom? They would know soon enough. Jonah raised his hand sharply, signaling for silence. They crouched behind a massive spruce, its branches heavy with snow. Through the cabin's window, a lone figure passed in front of the lantern, casting a brief shadow against the golden light. Esther held her breath, pressing closer to the tree's rough bark. Micah stirred against her chest but remained mercifully quiet. Henry kept one hand on the horse's reins, preventing any nervous movement that might give away their position. "Stay here," Jonah whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening wind. "I will check it out." He moved like a shadow himself, years of mountain living evident in every careful step. The snow beneath his boots made no sound as he crept closer to the cabin. Esther watched his broad shoulders disappear into the growing darkness, her heart pounding. Minutes stretched like hours. The lantern light continued its steady glow, and occasionally they caught glimpses of movement inside. Henry remained perfectly still beside her, but she could sense his tension. Finally, Jonah's shape emerged from the gloom. He moved quickly back to their position, keeping low. "One man inside," he breathed, crouching beside them. "Not one of the tattooed bunch. Looks like a prospector or traitor. Definitely not our pursuers." "You're certain?" Henry asked. "Yes. He's alone, nervous, jumping at shadows." Jonah straightened slightly. "I'm going to approach openly. Better to deal with this straight on before we lose more daylight." Esther caught his sleeve. "Be careful." Jonah's expression softened momentarily. Then he stepped out from behind the spruce, moving deliberately toward the cabin with his hands raised well away from his weapons. "Hello, the cabin," he called out, his voice calm but carrying clearly. There was a sudden scrambling sound from inside. The door burst open, and a wiry man appeared with a shotgun pointed directly at Jonah's chest. "Stay back!" the man shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I will shoot!" "Easy now," Jonah said, keeping his hands visible. "Just looking for shelter. No need for shooting." The man's gun wavered slightly. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Name's Jonah Hale. I trap these mountains." He kept his voice steady, reasonable. "We've been riding hard. Just need a place to rest our horses." "We?" The prospector's eyes darted nervously to the shadows behind Jonah. "My friends and I. 3 adults, 1 baby. We mean no harm." The man lowered his shotgun slightly. "Baby, you say?" Jonah nodded slowly. "That's right. The little one's sick with cold. We need shelter even if just for a short while." The prospector hesitated, then lowered his weapon completely. "I'm Silas. Silas Pike." He peered into the darkness. "Saw some rough-looking fellows earlier. Hunting a woman with a baby, they said." "That so?" Jonah's voice remained carefully neutral. Silas nodded. "Didn't like the look of them, especially their leader, mean-eyed fellow with strange marks on his neck." "Those are the men we're avoiding," Jonah admitted. "The shed out back. Would you let us use it? Just long enough to warm the child?" Silas considered this, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "Shed's not much, but it's solid enough. Tell you what, help me fix my frozen stovepipe and you can stay there till morning if you need to." "Much obliged." Jonah turned slightly, signaling to the others. Henry emerged first, leading the horses. Esther followed, holding Micah close. Silas watched them approach, his expression softening at the sight of the baby bundled against the cold. "Poor little mite," he murmured. "Shed's this way. Mind your step. There's ice near the door." The shed was small but weather-tight, with enough space for them to settle in relative comfort. Henry tended to the horses while Jonah helped Silas with his stovepipe. Esther sat on a pile of empty grain sacks, finally able to check Micah properly in the dim light filtering through the shed's single window. His cough had eased somewhat, but his cheeks felt too warm against her palm. She hummed softly, rocking him while she listened to the men working outside. The sound of metal scraping against metal carried clearly in the still evening air. After about an hour, Jonah returned, brushing soot from his hands. "Pipe's clear now. Silas is grateful for the help." "What else did he tell you?" Henry asked quietly. Jonah's expression darkened. "He overheard more than I'd hoped. One of the riders was talking freely, said something about delivering the Barstow brat to the ranch border by week's end." Esther felt her blood run cold. "Week's end? That's only 3 days away." "They're confident they'll find us," Henry observed. "Too confident, maybe." Jonah nodded grimly. "Which means we need to move again, soon." "But it's almost dark," Esther protested, though she already knew what his answer would be. "Darkness is our friend right now," he said gently. "The snow will hide our tracks, and they won't expect us to travel at night." Henry moved to the shed door, checking the sky. "Cloud cover's coming in. No moon tonight." They prepared to leave as quietly as possible. Esther secured Micah in his sling while the men readied the horses. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind carried the promise of more snow. Silas appeared at the shed door, his lantern casting long shadows. "You're leaving then?" "Better this way," Jonah said. "Less you know about our direction, safer for everyone." The prospector nodded understanding. "I'll douse my light once you're clear. Good luck to you." He looked at Micah's sleeping face. "God keep the little one safe." They led the horses carefully away from the shed, moving deeper into the gathering darkness. True to his word, Silas extinguished his lantern behind them. The cabin disappeared into the gloom, leaving them alone in the silent, snow-covered forest. Their boots made no sound in the fresh powder as they moved steadily away from their brief sanctuary. Above them, heavy clouds blotted out the stars, and the first fresh snowflakes began to fall, erasing all sign of their passing. Darkness wrapped around them like a heavy blanket as they followed the frozen riverbank southward. The horses moved cautiously, their hooves crunching through layers of snow and ice. Wind whistled through bare branches overhead, carrying bitter cold that seemed to slice through clothing. Jonah led the way, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill. Every few minutes, he would pause to listen, making sure no other travelers shared the night with them. Henry rode close behind Esther, whose mount plodded steadily despite the treacherous footing. Micah stayed mercifully quiet, bundled against his mother's chest beneath Jonah's heavy coat. But Esther couldn't stop her teeth from chattering. The cold had worked its way deep into her bones, and exhaustion made every mile feel endless. The frozen river gleamed faintly under scattered starlight, a silvery ribbon cutting through the darkness. Ice had formed fantastic shapes along its edges, like delicate lace frozen in mid-flow. Their breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. How much further? Esther whispered, trying to keep her voice steady despite her shivering. Henry urged his horse forward until he rode alongside her. Not far now. There's a hunter's cave I know, used it many times. Should be just ahead. Jonah turned slightly in his saddle. You certain you can find it in the dark? Yes, Henry replied confidently. The river bends sharply near there. Cave sits about 20 feet up the bank, hidden behind a stand of cedars. They pressed on, following the riverbank's gentle curve. Esther focused on staying upright in the saddle, fighting waves of bone-deep weariness. The coat around her shoulders still held traces of Jonah's warmth, but it wasn't enough to stop the violent trembling that had taken hold of her body. Jonah, she called softly, hating the weakness in her voice. I don't know how much longer. He reined his horse around immediately, concern evident even in the dim light. Henry? Half an hour at most, Henry assured them. Less if we push harder. No, Jonah decided, studying Esther's hunched form. Slow and steady. Better to arrive safely than rush and risk the horse's footing. The next 30 minutes stretched endlessly. Esther concentrated on breathing, on staying conscious, on holding Micah secure against her. The baby stirred occasionally but remained surprisingly peaceful given their circumstances. Finally, Henry raised his hand, signaling them to stop. Here, the cedars mark the spot. They dismounted carefully, legs stiff from cold and riding. Jonah helped Esther down, while Henry led them up a slight incline. True to his word, a dark opening appeared behind a thick screen of cedar branches. The cave wasn't deep, but it offered blessed shelter from the wind. Henry moved with practiced familiarity, gathering smaller branches that had blown inside. Within minutes, he had arranged a small fire pit well back from the entrance, where the flame would be hidden from outside view. Keep it small, Jonah instructed as Henry struck his flint. Just enough for warmth. The tiny fire caught quickly, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Esther sank down gratefully near its warmth, cradling Micah close as she unwrapped him enough to check his condition. His cheeks felt warm, but his breathing seemed easier than earlier. Jonah brought their saddlebags inside while Henry tended to the horses, securing them in a natural hollow beside the cave, where they would be protected from the worst of the wind. The animals' dark shapes blended perfectly with the shadows. Here, Jonah said quietly, pulling a tin cup from his pack. He filled it with snow and set it near the fire to melt. For the little one's milk. Esther managed a grateful smile. Thank you. For everything. He nodded once, then moved to the cave entrance, positioning himself where he could watch the river trail below while remaining hidden from view. Henry returned shortly after, bringing an armful of additional branches for the fire. The warm milk helped Micah settle into proper sleep for the first time in hours. Esther held him close, humming softly as she fed him. The fire's heat gradually seeped into her frozen limbs, and the violent shivering finally began to ease. Try to rest, Henry suggested, settling down nearby. Jonah and I will take turns watching. She wanted to protest, to insist she could help keep guard, but exhaustion won out. Wrapping Jonah's coat around both herself and Micah, she leaned back against the cave wall. Sleep claimed her almost instantly. Hours passed in relative peace. The fire burned low but steady, carefully maintained by whoever kept watch. Outside, the night remained silent except for the occasional cry of a distant owl or the soft nickering of their horses. Jonah stood his vigil at the cave mouth, eyes scanning the darkness below. Every shadow, every movement drew his attention, but the trail remained empty, and the river continued its frozen sleep undisturbed. until just before dawn, when a sharp crack split the silence. Jonah tensed, hand moving instinctively to his weapon. Another crack followed, branches snapping under weight. Someone was moving along the river trail. He crossed to where Henry slept and touched his shoulder once. The Cherokee tracker woke instantly, reading Jonah's expression in the dim firelight. Without a word, they moved to extinguish the remaining flames. Esther stirred at the sudden darkness but remained quiet, tightening her hold on Micah. They could all hear it now, the muffled sound of hooves in snow drawing steadily closer. Jonah and Henry eased towards the cave entrance, weapons ready but not drawn. The pre-dawn light was just strong enough to make out shapes moving below, 2 riders following the river's course. Everyone in the cave held their breath as the riders passed directly beneath their position. The men spoke in low voices, their words carried away by the wind, but their intention was clear as they studied the ground for tracks. Minutes crept by until the riders disappeared around the river's bend. Still, Jonah and Henry waited, making certain no others followed behind. Finally, when the sound of hooves had faded completely, Jonah allowed himself to relax slightly. "They're searching methodically," Henry observed quietly, "working their way south." "Which means more will follow this trail," Jonah agreed. He turned to where Esther sat in the darkness. "How's the little one?" "Sleeping," she whispered back. "What do we do now?" Henry moved to rebuild their small fire, keeping it barely more than embers. As warm light slowly filled the cave again, they could see the exhaustion written on each other's faces. "We need to end this," Jonah said finally. "We can't keep running forever." "The branding shed," Henry suggested after a moment, "near the Barstow borderland." Jonah nodded slowly. "I know it. Abandoned last season when they moved the operation north." "It's where they'll expect us to be," Henry continued. "A natural meeting point, visible from the main trail." "Which makes it dangerous," Esther said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "But also predictable." "Exactly." Jonah's expression was grim. "They'll gather there, thinking they have us trapped. Instead, we choose the ground. We set the terms." Dawn was breaking outside the cave, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and gold. They ate a quick meal of dried meat and hard biscuits, then began preparing to move out. "It's risky," Henry admitted as they saddled the horses. "But it may be our only chance to face them directly, end this chase once and for all." Esther secured Micah in his sling, then mounted her horse with Jonah's help. The baby stayed asleep, unbothered by the morning's activity around him. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering any trace of their presence near the cave. The rising sun cast long shadows across the gleaming white ground as they urged their horses forward. Jonah took point again, leading them away from the river and toward the distant Barstow lands. Behind them, their tracks disappeared quickly under wind-blown snow, leaving no trail for others to follow. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The branding shed waited somewhere in the distance, their chosen battleground. Whether it would prove to be their salvation or their undoing remained to be seen. Morning sunlight filtered through the bare branches overhead as they made their way across the rolling terrain. Jonah led them along the tree lines, staying within the shadows whenever possible. The horses' hooves crunched softly in the crusted snow, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Esther kept Micah bundled close against her chest, his small form secure in the makeshift sling. The baby had begun stirring more frequently, making tiny sounds of discomfort despite the warmth of the blankets. She hummed softly to him, trying to keep him calm as they traveled. "How much further?" she whispered to Jonah when they paused briefly to water the horses at a half-frozen stream. 3, maybe 4 hours to the borderlands, he replied, scanning the horizon. Depends on how careful we need to be. Henry appeared silently from the trees where he'd been scouting ahead. His expression was grave as he approached them. Fresh tracks, he reported in a low voice. 2 sets of riders moving fast toward the shed. Jonah's jaw tightened. They're gathering, just like we thought. The snow's good for tracking, Henry continued, but it works both ways. We need to stay under cover. They mounted up again, pushing the pace faster than before. Jonah led them through a series of small valleys, using the natural contours of the land to shield their movement. The morning wore on as they traveled, the sun climbing higher in the pale, winter sky. By midday, Micah had grown restless, squirming against Esther's chest. She pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering quiet prayers as she held him. Hush now, little one. Please stay quiet for Mama. The terrain began to change as they neared the Barstow borderlands. The rolling hills flattened out, giving way to open rangeland dotted with patches of scrub pine. In the distance, they could make out the dark shape of the abandoned branding shed. Henry rode ahead once more, disappearing into a stand of trees. When he returned 15 minutes later, his expression was even more serious than before. 4 horses tied behind the shed, he reported. Men inside. I heard voices. Jonah nodded grimly. Time to go on foot. We'll leave the horses here. They dismounted in a small hollow, securing their animals where they would be hidden from view. Esther's legs trembled slightly as she stood, stiff from riding. Jonah touched her arm briefly. Stay close, he instructed. We'll approach from the west, using that old corral for cover. They moved forward carefully, crouching low as they made their way through the knee-high grass. The collapsed remains of the corral fence provided a natural barrier, its weathered boards half buried in snow. Wait here, Jonah told Esther when they reached the fence. Keep Micah quiet. We'll circle around and see what we're dealing with. Esther pressed herself against the wooden boards, heart pounding as she watched Jonah and Henry split up, moving in opposite directions around the shed. Micah stirred against her chest, and she held him tighter, praying he would stay silent. The sound of angry voices carried from inside the shed. Through gaps in the worn planks, she could see movement, shadows passing in front of the dirty windows. The tattooed stranger's voice rose above the others, harsh and threatening. I'll prove it's there, he snarled. Heat up that iron. We'll find the mark one way or another. Esther's blood ran cold as she realized what he meant. Through the window, she could see the man holding a branding iron, its end glowing dull red in the dim interior. Her arms tightened instinctively around Micah. Suddenly, the sound of approaching horses broke through the tension. A new group of riders appeared, their mounts' hooves kicking up snow as they approached the shed at a gallop. At their head rode a well-dressed man Esther recognized instantly, the Barstow heir himself. The riders dismounted quickly, and the heir strode toward the shed's entrance. "Where is the child?" he demanded. "I won't have you marking what's mine." Chaos erupted inside as the two groups confronted each other. Esther could see Jonah tensing, preparing to move. Henry had worked his way around to the back of the building, bow drawn and ready. In that moment, Micah let out a thin cry. The sound carried clearly in the cold air. Esther tried to muffle it, but it was too late. Boots crunched in the snow behind her, and rough hands seized her arms, dragging her to her feet. "Found them," a voice called out. "Behind the fence." Esther struggled, trying to protect Micah as they pulled her toward the shed. She caught a glimpse of Jonah's face, rage and determination transforming his usually calm features as he burst into motion. The door of the shed crashed open as her captors forced her inside. The tattooed stranger turned, branding iron still in hand, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The Barstow heir stepped forward, reaching for Micah. Wood splintered as Jonah hit the door with explosive force, his roar of fury filling the small space. Henry's bowstring sang, and chaos erupted in the confined space of the shed. The battle for Micah's future had begun. The branding shed erupted into chaos as Jonah burst through the door. Splinters of wood flew through the air as his massive frame filled the doorway. His face was a mask of controlled fury, fingers white-knuckled around his axe haft. Two of the Barstow men rushed him immediately. Jonah met the first with a swift, precise strike to the knee that sent the man sprawling. The second caught the axe haft across his chest, the blow driving the air from his lungs. Both collapsed, gasping and immobile. Henry's bow sang from the back entrance, his arrow striking true. The ringleader's pistol went spinning across the dirt floor, knocked cleanly from his grip by Henry's perfect shot. The man clutched his stinging hand, cursing. "Stay back," the tattooed stranger snarled, advancing on Esther with the branding iron extended. She pressed herself into the corner, wrapping both arms around Micah and turning her body to shield him completely. "You'll not touch my baby," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I don't care what marks you think you'll find. He's mine." Jonah moved like a mountain cat, covering the distance in 2 long strides. His hand locked around the stranger's wrist, twisting until the branding iron clattered to the ground. The man tried to fight back, but Jonah's fury was unstoppable. One sharp blow, and the tattooed stranger joined his companions on the floor. The Barstow heir stood frozen for a moment, his fancy coat covered in dirt from the scuffle. As Jonah turned toward him, the man bolted through the door. They heard hoofbeats pounding away across the snow. "Let him run," Henry said quietly. "We have what we need here." Jonah grabbed the tattooed stranger by his collar, hauling him up against the wall. "Talk," he commanded. "The truth about the birthmark, all of it." The man's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. "It was never real," he admitted. "The old man's will had conditions about bloodlines and inheritance. The sons, they needed a way to control who could claim the estate." "So you invented the prophecy," Jonah pressed, "about marked children." "Made it up complete," the stranger nodded. "Needed someone outside the family to pin it on, someone who couldn't fight back. The cook's widow seemed perfect. No connections, no power, just her and the baby." Esther's breath caught as understanding dawned. "They used us," she whispered. "Made us run just to support their lie." Henry began gathering rope from the shed's stores, while Jonah secured the prisoners. They bound the men's hands tightly, checking each knot twice. The tattooed stranger's companions were still conscious but subdued, knowing they'd been beaten. "We'll take them to Sheriff Cutter in Ridgeway," Jonah decided. "He needs to hear this confession himself." Henry slipped out to retrieve their horses from the hollow where they'd left them. The afternoon light was already starting to fade as he returned, leading their mounts. Esther approached Jonah as he finished binding the last man. Her eyes were bright with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You risked everything for us." Jonah's expression softened as he looked at her and Micah. "No need for thanks. Some things are worth fighting for." They led the prisoners outside, mounting their own horses while keeping the bound men on foot. Henry fashioned a rope line to keep them all connected and controlled. The small procession began moving slowly across the snow-covered range as darkness crept in around them. Micah had settled into exhausted sleep against Esther's chest, wrapped warmly in Jonah's spare coat. The night was clear and cold, stars beginning to glitter overhead as they made their way toward the nearest settlement. Their pace was deliberate, careful in the growing dark with their prisoners in tow. The truth had finally come to light. Esther and Micah were free of the shadow that had haunted them, not marked, not claimed, simply caught in other men's greed. As they rode through the gathering night, that knowledge brought its own kind of warmth, despite the winter chill. Dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and golds as their weary group approached Ridgeway. The modest frontier town emerged from the morning mist, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a simple white church. The sheriff's office stood near the rail freight post, its windows already glowing with early lamplight. Jonah led their procession down the main street, drawing curious stares from townspeople beginning their daily routines. The prisoners stumbled forward, exhausted from the night's journey, while Henry kept watchful eyes on their rope line. Esther rode behind them, Micah sleeping peacefully in her arms. Sheriff Abram Cutter met them at his office door, his lined face stern but fair beneath a gray-streaked mustache. He listened intently as Jonah detailed the conspiracy, the chase through the mountains, and the final confrontation at the branding shed. The tattooed stranger, now subdued, confirmed everything under the sheriff's steady gaze. "Much obliged for bringing them in," Cutter said, directing his deputies to secure the prisoners. "I'll wire the other county seats today. Make sure justice gets done proper." He turned to Esther with genuine concern. "Ma'am, you've been through quite an ordeal. This town looks after its own." Word spread quickly through Ridgeway. By noon, the church bell rang out, calling townsfolk to gather. The simple sanctuary filled with ranchers in clean shirts, veterans wearing faded uniforms, and women in well-mended dresses. Sheriff Cutter stood before them, his badge catching the light from stained glass windows. "Friends," he began, voice carrying to the back pews, "I want to set things straight about Mrs. Esther Cadell and her boy." He explained the Barstow conspiracy clearly, praising Jonah and Henry's courage in bringing truth to light. This good woman was targeted by men whose greed outweighed their honor. She deserves our welcome and protection. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the congregation. Several widow women nodded knowingly, understanding what it meant to face the frontier alone. The pastor stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on Micah's head as he offered a prayer for their safety and healing. After the gathering, townspeople surrounded Esther with practical kindness. Women pressed warm quilts and food baskets into her arms. A rancher's wife insisted on sharing preserved fruits from her root cellar. The general store owner offered credit for supplies, waving away Esther's protests. As evening settled over Ridgeway, Esther, Jonah, and Henry shared a hearty supper provided by grateful neighbors. They sat at a corner table in the boarding house, bowls of steaming stew and fresh bread before them. Micah cooed contentedly in a borrowed cradle, wrapped in one of the gifted quilts. "The town's been more than kind," Esther said softly, breaking a piece of bread. "I never expected such welcome." Henry smiled. "Good folk recognize their own, sister. They see your strength." Jonah remained quiet, pushing his stew around more than eating it. His thoughts seemed far away, troubled despite their victory. As night deepened, he slipped out to the stable while Esther was occupied with Micah. The moon cast long shadows as Jonah began saddling his horse. His movements were efficient but heavy, each buckle and strap secured with familiar precision. He told himself this was right. Esther deserved better than a scarred drifter who'd lost his way years ago. She needed someone steady, someone who could give her and Micah a proper home. The moonlight silvered his horse's coat as he tightened the final strap, preparing to leave before Esther could notice his absence. His path led back to the mountains and solitude. It was better this way, he thought. Better to go now, while the memory of their time together was still clean and bright, unmarred by his shadows. Jonah's boot had just touched the stirrup when a soft voice broke the night's silence. "You mean to leave without saying goodbye?" He turned to find Esther standing in the moonlit street, Micah bundled warmly against her chest. Her eyes held both hurt and understanding as she stepped closer to his horse. "Reckon it's better this way," Jonah said quietly, his hand still gripping the saddle. "Town's accepted you. You'll have protection here." "That's not why you're leaving," Esther said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not running from danger anymore, Jonah Hale. You're running from belonging." The words struck him like a physical blow. He stood frozen, one foot still in the stirrup, as Esther continued. "You saved us before you knew our names," she reminded him. "Before you knew anything about Micah or the Barstow men. You saved us because that's who you are. A protector. A good man." She shifted Micah in her arms, and the baby made a small, contented sound. "God didn't bring us together just to have you disappear into the mountains again." From the shadows near the stable door, Henry watched silently, arms crossed, and a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Jonah's shoulders slumped, his carefully built resolve crumbling. He stepped down from the horse, his boots crunching softly in the packed snow of the street. "I ain't fit company for a family," he protested weakly. "Got too many dark memories?" "Then let us help you make brighter ones," Esther answered. She closed the distance between them, close enough that Jonah could see the moonlight reflecting in her eyes. "Stay, at least long enough to help us build a safe home." Micah stirred, reaching one tiny hand toward Jonah's coat. Without thinking, Jonah caught those small fingers in his rough palm. Henry finally spoke from his position by the stable. "Listen to the wisdom being offered, brother. Some trails are meant to be walked together." The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Jonah nodded slowly. "Reckon I could stay a spell," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Help you get settled, proper-like." The weeks that followed proved transformative. They returned to Jonah's land in the high meadow, but this time with purpose and permanence in mind. The original cabin served as shelter while Jonah, aided by Henry and several townsmen, constructed a larger home nearby. Jonah worked from sunrise to sunset, his axe ringing through the clear mountain air as he shaped logs and fitted joints. He took special care with the interior, adding thoughtful touches like extra shelves for Esther's preserves and a window seat where she could mend clothes in good light. In the evenings, he devoted hours to carving a cradle for Micah, his knife moving carefully over the wood until every detail was perfect. The finished piece featured delicate pine boughs along the sides and a rising sun at the headboard, symbols of new beginnings. The community's support touched them deeply. Wagons arrived regularly with supplies, seed for spring planting, preserved foods for their winter stores, tools and implements necessary for homesteading. The pastor rode up one crisp morning to bless their new home, his prayer asking for protection and prosperity on their land. Esther brought special meaning to every corner of their home. She hung her mended shirt, the one torn during their first frightening encounter, beside the hearth. When Jonah questioned it, she explained softly, "To remember our deliverance, how fear turned to safety, and strangers became family." The night they finally moved into the new cabin, winter's first serious snow fell. The windows glowed with warm lamplight as Esther prepared supper at the new cook stove. The familiar sense of bread and stew filled the air while she hummed an old hymn. Jonah sat before the fireplace, Micah cradled securely in his arms. The baby watched the dancing flames with heavy-lidded eyes, his small hand clutching Jonah's shirt. The fire's warmth wrapped around them like a blanket, and Jonah felt something shift deep in his soul. Maybe, he whispered, so quietly only Micah could hear. "Someone saved me first." The words felt like truth, like pieces of a broken faith finally mending. Henry, who had stayed to help them settle, smiled from his seat by the window. Outside, snow continued falling softly in the gathering dusk, but inside their cabin, lamplight spilled golden across the wooden floors. Tomorrow would bring more work. There were always tasks waiting on a homestead. But tonight was for savoring the gift of belonging. The cradle stood ready in the corner. The mended shirt hung as a testament by the fire, and in the warmth of their new home, surrounded by the love of chosen family, the wounds of the past began to heal. Jonah looked up to find Esther watching them, her eyes bright with joy and unshed tears. In that moment, he knew with certainty that this was where he was meant to be, not alone in the wilderness, but here, helping to build something lasting and true. "Supper's nearly ready," Esther said softly, not wanting to disturb Micah's peaceful dozing. "Much obliged," Jonah replied, his voice thick with emotion. He cradled Micah closer, marveling at how such a small life had led him back to faith, family, and the courage to love again. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.